Hello there and welcome along to this video. We are looking at the Destruction of Sennacherib from the poetry collection Conflict in the anthology Towards a World Unknown. This is the fourth poem from the OCR anthology, so we're just going to get straight into it. The first thing that we'll do though briefly is just to look down at the bottom and find out who wrote this poem. So this is written by Lord Byron. Let's make some notes on the poet first, and there's not much to say because mostly this poem is rich in historical narrative, so we're going to have a look at that more than just the poet to begin with. We're going to focus on the historic context of it. But interestingly, Byron, quite a flamboyant character, known for his sort of liberal lifestyle, which is strange that he's writing this poem about a biblical account. He did write a whole section of poetry called Hebrew Melodies, and yeah, it's sort of an odd combination there, but that's probably because he was a romantic poet. So similar to Blake, as we've been thinking about, draws on biblical ideas, and this poem doesn't just draw on a biblical idea like Blake's poem Envy, where it kind of alludes to the Garden of Eden. This poem is written as a narrative of a factually correct, or sort of factually, historically viable moments in Israel's history. It's documented in the Bible, it's documented in the Assyrian texts as well, but Byron really does take the biblical line on things, and we'll think about that in a minute. So he uses this religious topic to talk about conflict here, and he does use quite a lot of biblical stories in his work. He actually uses quite archaic language in this poem, and we're going to have a little think about why that is in a second. But that's one thing that we should probably go through before we read the poem. Some of the kind of slightly more difficult words to understand. But that's all I'm going to say about this poet for now. Obviously lived a bit later than Blake, but a very good poem. I enjoyed reading this one. I hope you do too. Let's go for a bit of historical context before we start thinking about what this poem, in terms of analysis, what it means. So we're going to look at two words in the title just to get a sense of the history here. Sennacherib is not a place, this is a person. He is a king, he was a king of the Assyrian Empire. So before Rome had an empire, the Assyrian Empire, about 700 years BC, the Assyrian Empire was very large. It covered most of what we would call today the Middle East, and even down to Egypt, and even up to Turkey as well. So it was a huge empire, and the way that they got their empire was in the sort of old-fashioned way of invading, imposing ideology on the country that they'd invaded, and just kind of occupying the land. So the king of Assyria, this guy Sennacherib, had done that, and he'd marauded through lots and lots of different regions. And this particular poem is set just as the army is about to plans to attack Jerusalem. Now King Hezekiah is on the throne here. He's on the throne, and he's a Jewish king. He rules over that area that we would call Israel today, and he has this idea. He sort of wants to pray to God to help the Jewish people retain their land, not get taken over by this man Sennacherib. And Sennacherib decides that he's going to send, I think it's something like 185,000 troops, soldiers, to camp just outside Jerusalem before they attack the next day. But actually what happens in terms of the destruction, Hezekiah's army doesn't have to really move a muscle. Their God, the Lord destroys the army. The biblical account of this is quite shocking. It's quite dramatic. The night before they're set to besiege the city, the night before that attack, it says that the Lord's army, angel of death, visits the camp and kills 185,000 troops in one night. And so the Israelites don't have to raise an army. They don't have to battle. They don't have to be in conflict with them. So we could see that the conflict in this poem is maybe the conflict between God and man, conflict between God and man. Maybe it's the conflict between Hezekiah and Sennacherib, Israelites and the Assyrians. It's quite a famous conflict. And obviously we're looking at just a general sort of conflict in battle as well. It's a battle poem. Just move that up. So there's a conflict between God and man. There's a conflict between Hezekiah and Sennacherib, and there's a conflict in battle as well. Well, what do we need to say about this poem before we start reading? The form, as I already said, this is not just an allusion to a biblical event. This is completely based on the biblical account. Interestingly, the Assyrian account is different to this, but as the Israelites were sort of the winning side after this battle, I guess they get to write it in the way that they want to, and also Byron seems to side with that side of the story as well. So the form, we would probably describe this as being a narrative poem, but it's also could be called a ballad as well. As we can see, the verses are all self-contained. It's in quatrains, so it does seem a little bit like a ballad. It's got a rhyming structure, but mostly this is a narrative poem. It tells the story from the biblical account, and I think that you can find the full story of this in the biblical Old Testament book 2 Kings 18 and 19. So just before we read the poem, I just thought it would be useful to read a little bit from this passage here. So you can read the full story, but this is what the Lord says in the Bible. Therefore, thus saith the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, that's Sennacherib, he shall not come into this city, that's Jerusalem, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with shield, nor cast a bank against it. By the way that he came, by the same shall he return, and shall not come into this city, saith the Lord. For I will defend the city to save it, for mine own sake and for my servant David's sake. Another Jewish king. And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. That's 185,000 people. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So I guess that's talking about when they arose, when the Israelites arose, they looked and behold, all they saw was dead corpses of the Assyrians. So Sennacherib, what does he do? Remember, he's not in that camp. He sent his armies to the camp. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed. When he heard about it, he just ran away and went and returned to Nineveh. Okay, so that's the bit from the Bible there. It's really important that we understand that before we get into the actual poem. But we're going to do that now. And I think there are some words that we will just go through in terms of vocabulary, because as I said, it's written in quite an archaic way. Lord Byron would have read the King James version of the Bible, I'm pretty sure. And so it's important that we get a good understanding of these words that are a little bit archaic to us now. Let's read it through. The Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea when the blue wave rolls nightly on deep Galilee. A couple of things to say. The fold is describing a sheep pen. Imagine all these sheep sort of penned in together, and the wolf is just going to dart down the mountain and ravage these sheep. They're all kind of cooped up like sitting ducks, we would probably say now. And his cohorts, the cohorts were just referring, I think, to the armies. just the people who were there, the whole load, the whole group of the army. This is the Assyrian army. Think about this word purple as well. It's kind of getting connotations of royalty and wealth. But Galilee is a sea, the Sea of Galilee in Israel. And he could have said any sea, but he's chosen this Sea of Galilee. And this is a recurring pattern that happens in this poem. It's like he could have mentioned any image in this first line here, a wolf and then a fold of sheep. He could have said it came down like a tiger on a deer, but that's not biblical imagery. So that's the reason why he keeps coming back to these things. Galilee is from the Bible. Wolves and sheep are really important images in the Bible. We'll carry on and we'll come back to that. Like the leaves of the forest when summer is green, that host with their banners at sunset were seen. Like the leaves of the forest when autumn hath blown, that host on the morrow lay withered and strown. Strown just meaning to scatter. Scattered. Now, interestingly, how quickly has that turned? We haven't even got through verse 2 and already withered and strown. The army that were so strong, gleaming bright, have already been defeated. And we haven't even got to the end of verse 2. It has changed very quickly. So the rest of the poem is going to be all about what they look like now that they're dead and how the Assyrians respond to that. So how has this happened? For the angel of death spread his wings on the blast and breathed in the face of the foe as he passed, and the eyes of the sleepers waxed deadly and chill, and their hearts but once heaved and forever grew still. And this is quite a chilling kind of image at the end here, but it's kind of contrasted with this exclamation mark that I find quite strange. Firstly then, so the angel of death would be referring to God's angel. Don't misunderstand this. This is not the devil. This is the angel that God is sending to kill. And it happens a couple of times in the Bible, maybe a few more that I don't know of, but it happens, I believe I'm right in saying, when the children of Israel are in Egypt, God sends the angel of death on the Egyptians as the final 10th plague. And so we have to kind of assume that this is the same angel of death that God sends. And for some reason, Lord Byron has chosen to pick up on this idea of an angel of death, almost like that juxtaposition there. We don't expect it to be an angel of death. What else can we say? This word waxed here is a deliberately archaic word. So this is a biblical word. And it would be the kind of word that Shakespeare would use as well. It wouldn't really be the kind of word that a romantic poet would use, because remember, they were trying to emphasize the simplicity of language. So why is he kind of choosing this word? Because he could have just said became, and the eyes of the sleepers became deadly and chill. It would still fit with the beat, with the rhythm. But he uses this biblical word waxed, and it just means became. That's all it means. And again, he's making that constant connection back to the text that he's got his poem from. Verse 4, and there lay the steed with his nostrils all wide, but through it there rolled not the breath of his pride, and the foam of his gasping lay white on the turf, and cold as the spray of the rock-beating surf. So we're zooming right in now to just one horse. We've talked about the armies as they looked. We've talked about the armies as they looked after they've been defeated. We've talked about what the angel of death has done. And now we're just zooming right into one horse, perhaps to emphasize how innocent people have died as well. Innocent things, the horses. And I don't think there's anything else to define here. Turf just meaning grass. But interestingly, they come back to this idea of the sea. But now it's not something that's positive for the Assyrians. It's something that's negative. The foam, the horse is lying on the ground. And as it's been gasping for breath, it's kind of just foaming at the mouth. And that's what it reminds Byron of. The spray of the rock-beating surf. And there lay the rider distorted and pale, with the dew on his brow, and the rust on his mail. And the tents were all silent, the banners alone, the lances unlifted, the trumpet unblown. Mail just meaning armour, chainmail. Lances are weapons. And again, we're zooming into the rider now. The horse is dead, the rider is also dead. It's distorted and pale. It's strange to me that it kind of looks at the horse first and then at the rider, but I don't know really what the reason is for that. But it's nice that they've kind of said that nothing happened in this battle. The lances weren't even picked up. The trumpets to announce the coming of the army weren't even blown. And so everything is kind of finished. Everything is over before it even began, really, began in this poem. And the widows of Asher are loud in their wail, and the idols are broke in the temple of Baal. And the might of the Gentile, unsmote by the sword, hath melted like snow in the glance of the Lord. The Asher is widows of Asher, referring to, maybe this is a city. I think this is a city in Assyria. But the widows are obviously the women who have lost their husbands in this battle, so they're weeping. That's what they're crying about. The idols are broken in the temple of Baal. Baal was it comes up again and again in the Bible. It's described as a false god. It's described as one of the Assyrian gods. So they've somehow broken, they're crumbling before the might of the Lord of the Israelites. Gentile is a word that the Bible refers to as being someone who is not Jewish, not an Israelite. Unsmote, so they haven't been injured by Hezekiah's army, but they've melted because the Lord has just looked at them. That's the might. The might has melted like snow in the glance of the Lord, even though he didn't have to use a sword to do it. So that's the story of the poem, and it's quite interesting to me to think about one or two of the other points of interest in terms of language and structure. As we read it out loud, we get a sense of the rhythm of this poem. And if I'm going to make some notes about this, about something that's all the way through the poem, I want to try and make it up here. Rhythm and rhyme are really, really important in this poem, more so than any of the others so far in the anthology. And it reminds me of that poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson, Charge of the Light Brigade, because it's got the same rhythm, and there is a technical word for this in English. I wonder if you can hear it. The Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea when the blue waves roll nightly on deep Galilee. When I read it like that quickly, it has that accumulating pace to it. Okay, and the beat in there is really important, and Byron has created this, and the word for this is an anapestic rhythm. And it's in tetrameter as well, because there are 4 sets of those da 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 da. You can hear that there's 4 per line of unstressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, unstressed, stressed. So that's what we call an anapestic rhythm, and it gives this approach of the army as being something that is unstoppable. An anapestic rhythm makes me think of horses, it makes me think of galloping, it makes me think of something that is unstoppable, like they're so full of momentum. It's like a whole gang of horses just galloping down a mountain. They're not going to be able to be stopped at all. And the rhyme is in couplets all the way through, and it doesn't break once, which is quite interesting. Again, giving this sense of inevitability, that the pace quickens, the rhyme creates that sense of predictability. And so we can have this idea here about the rhyme and the rhythm of the poem being really important. That's the thing that is probably most important about this poem. But what I also like in this poem are the similes. The Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold. It's emphasising here how vicious and powerful they are, the approaching army are, compared to the vulnerable Israelite army. It's like they're little sheep and they're wolves, and the contrast there is huge. But it is also a very important biblical image, sheep being this sign of followers of Jesus. And also sheep were used in Old Testament sacrifices. Sheep are very important to Israelite people, Jewish people in their religion. The Lord gives them instructions on how to look after sheep and what sheep they should choose for the sacrifice and in the temple and things like that. And wolves would have been a massive threat to them because they would have preyed on this army. So this is something that is very rich in biblical imagery. And I want you just to note that how strong the Assyrian army is sort of portrayed as. That's what we're getting in the first bit here. So I'm working through this in terms of the how this develops stanza by stanza. The Assyrian army is powerful. There's nothing that can kind of go against them at the moment. The idea that the blue waves rolled, unstoppable. Like, have you ever stood and tried to stop the tide? It's completely pointless. You would never be able to do it. And so this idea that the waves are rolling, then they're not going to be able to be stopped by anything. And another another simile here that we get, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea, which is a really interesting image. Again, it's something that's rich in biblical imagery. The Lord, when he's promising things to the Israelites, he says that they're going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And so we've got this idea of imagery here, but it seems that everything is against these Israelites to begin with. They've got spears, stars on the sea. You get this sibilance as well happening. Sibilance, when you think about that technique that's being used there, Byron is emphasising the evilness of the army. So not just that the army is powerful, they're not going to be stopped, but also that they are somehow evil because of this sibilance being used. The sheen of their spears was like stars in the sea. And so we're getting that idea here that the Assyrian army is both powerful but also evil, which means that we really want them to be defeated. Perhaps that's his purpose here. Like the leaves of the forest when the summer is green, that host of their banner at sunset was seen. Again, this lovely simile here. All the way through this poem there are similes, and I think they're really deliberately used. It's like he can't think of what it actually is. He has to liken it to something else. But perhaps we're saying that how strong they are. They keep growing in number because, like leaves in summer, they are not just bright, but they're strong, they're gleaming, they're growing in strength every day. And that's what they think they are like. But how quickly does this turn, like the leaves of the forest when autumn hath blown? So we go from leaves in the forest when summer is green, leaves in the forest when autumn hath blown. And I think this is a really good point to make as well, because I think lots of students at GCSE level can talk about similes. But when we have a look at this idea here of antithetical parallelism, this is important. Not only is he using, Byron would have known this, he would have 100% known this, not only is he using biblical imagery all the way through, not only is he using biblical words, he's also using biblical techniques. Antithetical parallelism. Parallelism is a massively Hebrew literature technique, and it's been used very, very well here. So it just completely turns what's happening on its head, just like the Assyrians are. So we get this false sense of security to begin with, only for it to be destroyed. Okay, so that host on the morrow lay withered and strown. And there's a few different moments of Hendiadys throughout this poem. Just again emphasising how easy it was for the Lord in one night to breathe on them and for them to be withered and strown. For the angel of death spread his wings on the blast and breathed in the face of the foe as he passed. Hear that anapestic rhythm still going, even though the armies are dead. It's like a takeover almost. The defeated army now lay dead, and the Lord is now carrying that momentum with him. Really quite striking bit of contrast here. Angel of death is a massive juxtaposition. It's juxtaposed. You don't expect an angel to be of death, but also the angel of death has breathed. Again, another juxtaposition here. How can that happen? How can someone who is the angel of death breathe? And not only that, but as he breathes, he makes the enemy dead. And the eyes of the sleepers wax deadly and chill. Again, a nice use of Hendiadys here. Just again, how easy is it? It sounds like deadly and chill. It sounds so easy for God, because these constant blast, pass, chill, still, constant rhyming couplets have this effect that it's almost a song. It's something that Byron maybe wants to be repeated, to kind of emphasize, maybe even you could say teach somebody what has happened in this biblical story. Interesting that they zoom straight into the horse. I think that's quite a strange choice. But talking about this idea here, the natural imagery coming in, the foam, the spray, the surf, reflecting the imagery that Byron established in that first stanza at the top about the stars on the sea. It's interesting how it's all turned on its head for the Assyrian army, and I'm sure there's lots of different reasons and interpretations that we can make for that. But maybe it's just that God is more powerful than man. Maybe it's that he can change nature for whoever he wants to prevail, to win, to be victorious. And so it's almost like the sea was used as a metaphor for power at the start, but now it's used as a metaphor for weakness, because just a little bit of foam, spray and surf is left of that powerful metaphor at the start. And how strange is this, that the chainmail, the armour that he was wearing, in one night has turned rusty. And again, we could kind of make this point that God has power even over nature, even over the rules of physics. It doesn't really seem possible that his armour has gone completely rusty just in one night, but that's how powerful God is being presented here. And the tents were all silent. Really important. And the banners alone, the lances unlifted, the trumpets unblown. This verse here deals with the things that didn't happen, that never had to happen. They never had to make a noise. They never had to lift up their weapons. They never even had to... They put their armour on, but it was no use. There was nothing that happened to them that meant that they had to have armour on. And I think this is quite interesting, the fact that we focus on the negatives here all the way through: unblown, unlifted, silent, no noises, everything still. Because it makes a good contrast for the final stanza 6. So we've got things that never happened, linked with the silent, sensory, imagery here, trumpets unblown. All the tents were silent, not what you would expect on the morning of a big battle, because now we've got the response of the people who are back home, and the widows of Asher are loud in their wail. Immense contrast here between the fifth and the sixth stanza. And the idols are broken in the temple of Baal, and the might of the Gentile and smote by the sword hath melted like snow in the glance of the Lord. Another really interesting biblical simile there. Something that is pure like snow, and it's like power mixed with purity here. Why didn't it say melted like chocolate in the glance of the Lord? Why didn't it say melted like butter in the glance of the Lord? Like snow would suggest that the purity of the Lord has prevailed as well as the power. Another thing to mention before we finish is the anaphora. You can't really ignore it through this poem. If a year 7 pupil had submitted a poem like this and they'd started their poem with and a lot of the lines with and all the way through, all the way down, look at all the ways that these it's not full of variety, is it, the way these lines start? But again, that sense of momentum, the anaphora is created, and that again is propelling the narrative forward. As if it's unstoppable. So at the start of the poem it seems that the Assyrian army are unstoppable, but actually how great their fall is. In the end, it's only the power of the Lord that prevails and is unstoppable. So what are some of the messages from this poem? We have to ask ourselves. We're going to ask ourselves about message. We're going to ask ourselves about tone. This is the final little bit that we're going to have a look at here. I'm going to start with the message of this poem because, and again, I'm just going to limit it to 3 things just to keep it simple and easy to remember. I think probably the first one is it is futile to go against God. I think that's a really clear message that Byron is making here. And maybe he's making the point that God is a protective God. God protects his people here, the people of Israel. And perhaps as a more general message, Byron's making the point here that humans are inferior to God. I think they're the clear messages throughout this poem, okay? As you look at these messages, it's important to tie in all of the analysis that we've just looked at, both structural, form, rhythm, rhyme, language, into these messages. You can't, in your essays, just write these 3 things and expect to get 100% marks. So the tone in this poem then, there seems to be this unstoppable tone. The armies are unstoppable at the start, and then it's almost like their defeat is completely unstoppable. It's futile for them to try and even fight against God. Maybe there's a sense in which there's an inevitability, because the title tells us what's going to happen at the start, and it's like that phrase, isn't it? How great the fall of those, like the higher you are, the greater the fall. It's like when politicians are caught out doing something wrong, it makes the headline news, whereas it doesn't really make the headline news if you forget to hand in an essay, because you're not someone of high status. But if a politician makes a big mistake, it's like how great the fall is of those people who set themselves up as being really great. So there's an inevitability here, and the title helps us with that. Do you think that there's perhaps a sense of gloating just in that final line there? And also, interestingly, the fact that they've got this exclamation mark in the very chilling horrible passage where it talks about that their hearts can't even beat anymore because they're going to grow still, they're growing cold, they're deadly. This is the whole part here about the angel of death. And then they've got a lovely like exclamation mark at the end, as if it's like, yeah, it's impressive, it's exciting, it's dramatic. And so perhaps the punctuation helps me to see that there is a sort of a gloating idea here. I'm going to put that exclamation mark, and that is on line 12. Well, what gives me a sense of inevitability in this passage? It's got to be the rhythm. It's got to be the rhyme. And again, these things kind of tie into the same idea here. Unstoppable, inevitable, momentum. The anapestic rhythm just drives it forward. We can also put the anaphora in this as well. Okay. And it's really important when you're thinking about your essays to think about how all of these things combine to create these messages in the poem of the Destruction of Sennacherib. So I hope you found the annotation video helpful. As you can see, we've done lots of work on the passage. It's not even really scratched the surface of what's going on in this poem, but it's a good start, and I hope you found it useful. Thank you.